Welcome to Life in Red.
One of my favorite TikTokers ever, because she's so great, Anushka. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that I get to be on this podcast. That's so cool.
As people know, I work in radio and I meet celebrities, and there's not often times I've been starstruck. But
Oh, shut up.
I'm a little starstruck here because you are.
Shut up.
I'm sort of flattering you, but I'm also sort of like, it's actually true. Like I appreciate your TikTok so much because it just gives me so much info about politics. And every time I think I know a little bit about politics, I'm like, wow, I don't know enough. So that's why I'm so happy to welcome you. And
I hear that. Thank you. That's super sweet. You're buttering me up right off the bat. But I honestly, like, I work in the field and I have a degree in it. I have 2 degrees in it technically, and I feel like I'd never know enough about it, right? Like, so we're all just here learning. So I really relate to that.
Absolutely. So we're here to talk about Ontario and our upcoming election here. But before we get into all the parties and all the nonsense that's already happening, let's talk about you. A young woman who has risen so far as a wonderfully, descriptive TikTok, like I said. How did you fall into politics? And I know you're a strategist. Like, explain what that is, because I think we hear that a lot, but what is a strategist for politics?
For sure. I'm happy to break this down because I feel like so many people don't quite get it, but they get it enough that they're like, oh yeah, she's like political.
Yeah.
Okay. So how I got into politics is that I was always interested in public policy, period. And I was always interested in community and like in getting involved with, frankly, human rights issues and issues that affected POC and women and LGBTQ folks, because I fall into all of those categories. And so that said, growing up, you kind of see the world through this specific lens of like, well, people like me are experiencing the world a little bit differently. What are the systems that affect that? And I was very cognizant of that from a very young age because I wasn't born in Canada. I moved here when I was fairly young, so I have the privilege of always having grown up here. I very quickly lost whatever accent I had before, and I very quickly blended in like very white society. But my parents were disenfranchised when they came here in a big way because they had to re-qualify in their professional degree. So they were qualified enough to come to Canada as immigrants, but not qualified enough to hold a job here and to be considered legitimate here without Canadian professional standards. And those standards can be like very onerous and set people back economically, just kind of the way a lot of them are structured, especially 20 some years ago when they first came here. So that said, I was always very cognizant of the fact that there was something in the system, and a lot of POC and immigrant families feel this way. They're like, there's something in the system here that it was not set up by us. It was not set up for us. It welcomes us or pushes us away on a whim sometimes, per government, per political movement, and we're the ones that are kind of, caught in the crossfire of politics. So that's, and I think that I've heard other POC communities like express this as well, and the Indo-Canadian community is no different. So that said, when I was in high school, I was so big on like giving back to the community and like community service, like non-political service. It's how you make change. And I was, a classic bleeding heart liberal, a young feminist who wanted to tell the boys why they were wrong and, be like, yeah, you make change in the world by like giving back and doing apolitical organizing because politics is messy. Then I get to university and I go, oh, you literally cannot do things without them being political. Like everything is political, whether or not we intend it. And I welcome pushback if you think differently, but I just have had this reaffirmed through everything. Like not a single person is untouched by politics. And of course, the more privileged you are, the more you can afford to ignore it. But everyone, we are all in this society that is intertwined with politics. You literally cannot extricate it. So that said, I was like, I think I want to get involved with like organizing. My friend brought me to Total Fluke, right? Because I was thinking about it and I was thinking about it for months prior, getting involved in like campaign work or, working or shadowing an MPP, working for or shadowing an MPP or whatever. But my friend just one day was like, you know what? You said you wanted to get involved in politics. There's this like, thing happening. It's an event. Come with me, be my plus one. I go, I network, I meet people, and then I get set up with like this person who connects me with the person who connects me with the person, and this is how it goes. This is how it goes in a lot of communities, but in politics included, where I ended up volunteering for an MPP, And I ended up door knocking and supporting like that organizational stuff on the ground for a field operation in a campaign. And it was just absolutely exhilarating. I loved it. It was so like process oriented in a way that I hadn't expected. And I thought I was interested in it purely because I was interested in public policy that could make a difference in the lives of marginalized communities, like what started this forever ago when I was younger. That's why I thought I was there. And suddenly I stuck around and stayed there because I was also fascinated by the process of creating somebody who becomes a change maker in those settings for those people. Does that make sense? Does that check out?
Yeah, it's
Like, does
interesting.
that
Yeah.
track? Okay. So that's what I didn't expect to fall in love with the process. I thought I just loved the issues. And it's a great thing when you like both because I it's led me to the career that I'm in now. I don't know if I'll stay in this forever, but basically I went through my undergrad, I went through my master's. My master's was in political science, and my undergrad was in international relations and like a pre-law-ish kind of program at U of T.
Mhm.
So I always was interested in like international law work. I thought I wanted to go into wanted to go to law school. I almost applied, but then I didn't apply because I was like, I'm not confident enough in this to do this yet. And I still love Canadian politics. And there were these like two tensions happening in my life where I was like, do I want to go work internationally and like do that and be in that world, or do I want to go to like, go to law school and be in Canadian politics and focus domestically, like where do I kind of belong? And I got some good advice from a big Canadian political figure
Mm.
who and it was just a total fluke because we both went to the same college at UC. Like I don't know if you know Bob Ray. Like
Yeah,
if you
of
remember
course.
Bob
Yeah.
Ray. Okay. Yeah. So a lot of people wouldn't, right? But there was like a fluke where like I ended up in a conversation with him, and I was like, do I go to law school? Like a classic university student making somebody else's, making my problems like a big political figures or someone else's. And I was like, should I go to law school? Like, do you regret going to law school? And he was like, I'm not going to tell you to go to law school because I don't want you to go to law school because Bob Ray told you to go to law school, which I thought was hilarious. And then he was like, think about how you want to operate and move through the world. He was like, do you want to be an individual that moves through the world, the global system, as an individual? And be an international lawyer, go work for the UN, or go do any of those things and be that individual. You're a Canadian person moving through that global system, and you can have that career and make the change that way. Or do you want to move through the world as Canada, as the state within the global system built for states? And do you want to make change that way? Like through that domestic power, you then end up hitting the international stage. And I think about this all the time. And what it did was it really brought me back to earth because it made me go, oh, like the fact that I love Canadian politics means that I love everything about politics. It doesn't mean that I can't like international relations. So this is really long winded, but bear with me here because we're getting to how I got into consulting and being a strategist, right? I end up doing a master's in political science for over COVID. And coming out of it, I get this job opportunity at this government relations and public affairs firm. And I never thought I wanted to work in government relations and public affairs. And it's a corporate job. And on a day to day basis, I'm doing like, GR and PR work. And that's my 9 to 5. And then after hours, I'm organizing and helping run campaigns and doing all these great things with this amazing community that I've had for years, but that I'm able to balance really well now and, take so much enrichment out of both these sides of my life. So that's how I got to this field. And it was sold to me like, oh, this corporate environment is like a campaign because it's consulting, but it's about government.
Mm.
So it feels like the energy is like a campaign team. So you'll like it. And I was like, okay. And so that's what it means. So when I say that I work in politics, I'm referring to both and either separately. Like I work
Mhm.
in government relations, but I also work in campaign organizing and in campaign strategy. And so whether that's a nomination race or a provincial race or a federal race, I am helping with the back end of making a candidate into a candidate. But that's all not my job, right? Like my job is to go to work 9 to 5 and to be a rep for my clients and to run PR and GR work. Like that's what I do.
Right. So there's two, but one. I get it.
There's two but one in a way, right?
And so many, I feel like we could do an entire episode about you and your experience and family and how this all sort of relates. And I'm glad you brought up Bob Ray because he comes up in Ontario a lot when it comes to our elections. Before we get to that, I just have one quick thought because I find this so fascinating. And you kind of mentioned it going from being that young feminist and sort of, like you said, like really caring about these issues, and then sort of finding out how the machine runs, and then how you said we all relate to politics. And what I'm super curious is as a young person, and especially seeing, Gen Z on TikTok, and, people that we kind of have this look at the world and politics where we don't currently like the system that we really have in place, especially as young people. It's not working for us, but it's the system we have. And so you have people become disengaged, and maybe they don't vote, or they don't believe in the candidates. And then, you sort of have all those issues there. I don't know if there's so much of a question, or just asking for a general thought, but how do we start to bridge that gap a little bit between, we care about a lot of issues, and it doesn't seem like the government can or is really equipped at the current moment to deal with a lot of these issues. And so how do we keep people engaged with our political system while, it seems that it's really not caring for the everyday person?
I think it's such an important question, and I have a couple answers here that, like, I'm how do I approach this? Okay, so right off the bat, on a bit more of like a vague level, I will say a big part of it is like engagement, is getting people to believe that they're doing this for a reason, and getting people to believe that they're casting their vote for a reason. And the reason is that this system exists whether or not you participate in it, and it governs your life whether or not you participate in it. So it is coming to you at very little cost that you just participate. And the fact of that participate, it's just it's so within reach. You just need to know how to go do it, and you need to be encouraged to do it. If you get someone to vote early in life, then they're far more likely to vote consistently for the rest of their life. Like, we are creatures of habit. So at that early level, especially, like, getting young people to just pay attention to, like, process, and this is how I vote and why voting is important, that's very, very big. Like, that's why I make TikToks in a big sense, because I always, like, I'm always a broken record about, like, politics is for everyone, politics is for everyone. But the reason I say that is because I was very young when I realized it was not. And it needs to be, but it's not yet. And we have to believe it is for everyone in order to make it for everyone. We have to make that a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that, like, what that means, political literacy and learning about how our system works, why your vote does actually make a difference, and then how to go cast it. That's like the base level, right? In a more detailed sense, though, that has to be a feedback loop. Like, I completely recognize that, like, yeah, it's not all on the shoulders of, like, young people who need to vote. Like, they can go cast their vote, but, like you're saying, they're not necessarily getting that support back from government that they need. But it's like a chicken and an egg thing, because good government responds to active voter bases. Like, government's entire job and trajectories is on the shoulders of how their voters are going to vote. And if you only have Ford conservatives voting, then you're only ever going to get a Ford government, and you're only ever going to get that feedback loop happening, right? And you know who that's serving. So I wish I had a perfect answer, but all I can think about when this comes up is, like, hope is really, really important, and believing that just taking that action of voting is going to do something, but not right away, over time. That's another thing. Like, so making people aware, getting people politically literate, like, that's, like, just at the core of all of it. There is also another piece of like, with that time bit, where I think Gen Z and millennials, we have inherited a really, really, like, messed up economy and a really, really messed up world. And there's a lot of resentment that's very fairly placed, on people generations before us that could buy houses easier, and who were just in completely different financial conditions. There was a more narrow wealth gap, like, all these things that we're very, very aware of as young people. But that resentment aside, change takes time to happen. And so, literally, like, we could have the voter participation rate. Oh, you're frozen. Hold on.
It's okay. I can still hear you, but you're frozen.
Yeah? Okay.
There we go.
Am I
Technology.
back now?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're good.
So you can have, like, the voter participation rate, which is, like, roughly 30%, 33%, right? Or no, I lied. Actually, I confused that. That's the margin of winning from the last election, I think.
Mm,
But there, you can take whatever the voter participation rate is, and you could increase it by like 10, 20%, and the government outcome would change a little, but maybe it wouldn't change a whole ton. But then, all those people will vote again, and then we increase it more the next time around. And so, over decades, over a generation, government really changes. Like the Liberal Party today in Ontario is so much more progressive
mhm,
than it was, however many years ago. The NDP used to oppose immigration at one point. Like there was like parties evolve. Like there's a big range, a big arc that all of them are going through. Doug Ford's Conservatives, I do not mince words about my distaste for the Ford government and its policies because I am a young progressive. But I will say, in fairness, they spend like a liberal slash NDP government. Like they spend like a progressive government. They do. They are called a progressive government by most other conservative or like other provinces. So it's all that longer term game.
right. Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky. And I'm glad we sort of touched on that, because I think the most important thing is you can have distaste for the system, but if you don't participate, then the establishment continues on and
Yeah.
nothing really happens. And so it's like, of course, in a perfect world solution, it would do the right thing, and sort of like go the way especially progressive voters might want. But um, like you have to make the best of a bad situation, I guess, for the most part. Um, Speaking of Doug Ford in Ontario, let's talk about Ontario. The story of the election for me, just speaking to people anecdotally and sort of intaking what I'm seeing on social media, is especially over the last 2 years, there's been a lot of like disdain and anger towards the Ford government. Especially over its pandemic response, some of the things that don't get shown, like where the money's going, all that stuff. They lost $10 billion or something ridiculous. But he's still leading in the polls. And that's very interesting to me, and I think would be surprising to a lot of people who participate in social media. What I hear from people is, yeah, I hate Doug Ford, but I hate the other parties more. I don't trust them. You speak of Bob Rae and, Ontario and Rae Days and the NDP government, like that's so long ago, but people who would live through that are still like, oh, NDP. You look at McGuinty, and I mean, I don't blame Wynne for a lot of it, but she's a part of the Liberal government that a lot of Ontario like voted to the third party. So I'm wondering, from your perspective in this world, what is the story of this election? What it like, it's sort of like, yeah, it's the devil we know, then the devil we don't know. That's what it seems to me. But like from your position, what is the story of this election and the parties?
So the way that people feel about Doug Ford is so interesting to me because it is very much a combination of that like historical and institutional distrust that you're talking about, but also combined with the fact that somehow they see him as a man of the people. Like he is a classic populist leader by Canadian standards. He is because he conveys himself as somehow a man of the people, anti-establishment, while being part of the establishment. That is like the cookie cutter definition of that, right? So that was how he got elected in the first place last time around, especially when you situate that in the context of everyone being really mad at Kathleen Wynne about hydro. When it's like Doug Ford mishandled the pandemic, I think that was a little, if not like that was way worse than how hydro went, if you ask me. But people do not hold that against him as much because they humanize him in a way that they would not necessarily humanize other leaders, especially a lesbian woman. And that is a fact. Like the way that people treated Kathleen Wynne, the way media treated Kathleen Wynne. Like I'm never going to be someone to cry rah rah fake media, but it's true that there was like an intense movement against her on behalf of voters, on behalf of media. Like there was like people were just like, so there was so much vitriol towards Kathleen Wynne. And the story of this election is to me a story of if you are someone who is a cultural phenomenon, then you can get away with way more mistakes.
Mm,
And the other leaders, what they lack, the unfortunate thing is that their weakness plays right into Doug Ford's strength. They are forgettable. Horvath and Del Duca are both experienced politicians. Andrea Horvath is running for her 4th election. This is her 4th chance at becoming premier as a leader, which, on a personal note, I'm like, that's a little bit too many. Like, you should be giving someone else space because it's probably in the best interest of your party. Del Duca, on the other hand, is a former cabinet minister under Wynne and has done a great job of like building up a party that's completely different. Like, this is a brand new slate of candidates. Is being really active about being progressive and diverse, and he's like, it's a brand new liberal party in so many ways. But he, despite all of his experience, despite all of that work, has struggled with being memorable and personable to the electorate, just like Horvath. And part of the thing with Horvath is that it is like the sexism, misogyny is always a factor, right? A part of it is that people call her shrill. People say she's, unlikable. She doesn't have a personality. People call Del Duca a robot. And then on the other side of the, aisle, you have Ford, who is this memorable, funny, whether it's a laugh with or a laugh at, it doesn't matter. He's funny and he's memorable and he's a cultural phenomenon, especially in his voter base. He's Ford Nation.
Yeah.
Like it's a movement. And movements are the most dangerous, if you ask me. They're the most like incredible in a lot of ways, right? Some of the best things we've ever achieved as society has been through big movements, like for rights and whatnot. But movements are powerful even when they're leveraged by the other side. And Ford has managed to create a very effective movement for himself in Ontario.
You look at Obama and change, like hope, right? Even Trudeau in 2016 was very much about hope. But then you're right. You look at the other side, you look at Trump and Make America Great Again. You look at Ford Nation. Like, it's almost like we forget about the issues. We forget about the platforms. And we're just like we're the lemmings, right? We're just like
following the leader.
Noise, like what's going on? And we sort of like gravitate to like you said, more of like the person, the party leader, the party, than the actual things that matter to us. And I'm curious, it's no question I don't know if we're so much as politically divided as we say in the media, as much as polarized, right? Like, there's not a lot of centrists anymore. There's like, you're really picking a side, and like you're digging your heels in on no matter what. And even if you think the perspective might change, or like, well, I can't go against, this thing. Like, there's not a lot of room for nuance and gray. And I'm just wondering, like, how does that all play into this election, especially when you consider that conservatives have the benefit of not splitting the vote, and then you sort of have progressives that have to split the vote between liberal, and this is federally and provincially. And then you get into the conversation about strategic voting, and you have people that hate that, and you have people, again, well, that's the system we have. We got to play the game. Where does this all fit into that narrative and story of the election? Because it's all so complicated, and I think it just really confuses the average voter who doesn't pay attention to politics and is just sort of like chimes in about a week before. Like, it's just a lot to sort of consider when it comes to just casting a vote.
It's true. So parties form when voter bases form. So from a logistical perspective, every party gets together when they have a very specific demographic of the vote that they're going after in order to represent them the best. Obviously, everyone wants to represent everyone, but you're going after your target voter base, right? So liberals are very, very popular in immigrant communities because they have done arguably the most for immigrant communities in the past, like, couple decades, especially federally and provincially, right? NDP, excuse me. My caramel latte went down the wrong tube. So NDP appeals a lot to workers. Like, they've always been the party of workers. They've, the unions and that blue collar, like, worker voter base has been very, like, integral to that party forming and figuring out an identity over the longer term. The conservative blocs usually, like, traditionally attract more rich corporations and individuals and donors, and it's like that more elite, historically, more elite support base, from what I understand. But there seems to be a shift in politics, both in America and here, in the past, like, decade or so, where conservatives are now appealing to low-income blue-collar workers, and especially low-income white people. And there's been, a concurrent flow of identity politics that's arisen, and a focus on like intersectional activism that has emerged and has been really, really empowering, but has created a weird like shift in how we are putting together these voter bases. And when I say we, I mean literally we as a society, like how we are aligning ourselves with different communities and groups. So it's shifting. Doug Ford is, and it's working. He's appealing to workers. He's making the PC party a party for workers, like for the workers. And this is working in Northern Ontario. It's working in rural Ontario. It's working like everywhere you can find a white person who feels like the current narrative on equality excludes them because they are still low income, or they are still filing their barriers, or perhaps they are just plain out racist. And it's because some people are.
Mhm.
And it's we're in this period of the ground shifting. I'm really curious to see where this goes. But I have no idea. So that's a part of, like, when you're talking about that divide, that's a part of it. Also, we're pretty predictable people. There's also an element of humans in general, we're pretty predictable as electorates. We in liberal democracies globally, there's a trend of like going outward to extremes and then coming inward to a center, then going outward and inward. And so like that is like a pattern that other liberal democracies with similar systems to us have followed in the past like century. So we right now are in a period of divide. Theoretically, we go back kind of towards like a bit more of like a moderate approach, but will we? Because we've never had Twitter as a factor. Like we've never had social media as a factor, right? So we have previously been predictable, but suddenly with social media changing the way elections are run and the way democracy happens and the way we all understand and access information about politics, what is that going to do? I think it's totally thrown a wrench in the whole
Mhm.
center out pattern. I think it's just totally driven us to like,
Yeah.
and I think that's only going to increase.
Yeah. Well, you see, especially in like America, I mean, America is the leader, and then we sort of follow behind. It's always interesting to see how much of America will take in. But you even see now in the midterm elections, and not quite, but they're sort of doing the midterm primaries, and you see like a lot of like far right people taking on kind of incumbent Republicans because they feel like now is a chance, and it's making moderate Republicans or moderate Democrats sort of not viable because people are like, well, no, like you sort of like get more embedded in these sort of beliefs, whether it's left or right. And then so people who
Yeah.
are just like sort of centrists, um, like that's like Biden's a great example. People on the left start to think that he's actually a Republican, and you could make an argument that some of his policy maybe is a bit more conservative, or you see people on like far right looking at people like Liz Cheney, who is like, oh no, she's a Democrat, she's left wing because she like. So you get that, and you're seeing it a little bit in Canada right now. I mean, Bernier didn't take what maybe some of his voters and he thought he would, but the conservative race is a great example right now of how the party is splitting between the far right and sort of like the moderate right, and how like what's the future of federal conservatives. And so federally is one thing, but provincially, I think affects our life a lot more. And I don't think we're seeing it quite at that level in Ontario yet.
No,
You
yeah,
see it in
yeah.
Alberta. I mean, as we record this, Jason Kenney just stepped down. Again, not really a question, but just sort of like some thoughts to that, because I mean,
No,
I don't know.
I no, I hear you. I hear you. It's so true. Like, so it's true that we follow America, but not like there are quite a few institutional barriers that quite literally mean we cannot, because we are a different system. We are a
Mhm,
completely different
mhm.
democratic system. So there is some institutional protection there from us completely going the way of the Americans, and that's for a different podcast perhaps. But in Ontario, you see a convergence almost of like the party's priorities. So the NDP, Liberal and Progressive Conservative platforms are all obviously distinct, and obviously there's especially a distinction between the Doug Ford and then the Progressives. But you have this further right section in Ontario that's feeling abandoned by Doug Ford and his Conservatives. So they've created other fringe parties like the Ontario Party and the New Blue or whatever.
Mhm.
And you have these far right folks, lacking, according to them, lacking this representation. And you know what? Not even just according to them. It's true. Doug Ford's progressive Conservatives have emphasized the progressive in the past 4 years. They have. It's not progressive enough for progressive voters like you or me,
Mhm.
but not too presumptuous. But and it is too much for people who are on that more right fringe. So we have a split, but I think it's just, first of all, we have fewer people in Canada, so already off the bat it's a bit more contained than America. Like as a country we have a lower population than like the single state of California.
Mhm.
But as an electorate, Canadians are also typically a bit more moderate. We are not as extreme culturally. We also don't have the same level of like patriotic rah-rah pride as America, except now that might be shifting and we might be
Mhm.
growing it a bit better and more. And
Mhm.
I use better pejoratively, right? Um, it's because we all saw the Freedom Convoy.
Yeah.
We all saw the way that Canadian flags were used like they were American ones, and it made me so uncomfortable. I was like,
Mhm.
I hate this. But then you think about it and you go, oh, it's literally that like Americans were highly involved in like the organizing and funding of that. Like
Mhm.
that was a very American exercise in joint work with Americans. So it's uncomfy to think of like these fringe movements that are emerging in Canada, but it's I think more a result of that far right feeling unrepresented because our government and our parties are moving more left. So in a weird circular way, it's kind of a good thing
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
progressives because it's like, okay, even our conservatives put a ton of money into programs, into funding. And we think about so when we think about what makes something conservative or liberal or left or all of these are just terms that we apply to like brackets of behavior.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
and like I said earlier, like parties evolve and change, and those very brackets are shifting. And so like it's just interesting. It's just interesting because the what we call conservative today is going to be so different than what like the generation after us calls conservative. And people have a huge venom for Doug Ford, and I'm not defending Doug Ford by any means, but he is comparatively not a conservative.
Mhm.
So it's compared to like actual conservatism, and like what is conservatism? Conservatism like is about like minimizing the role of government in your life. That is conservatism. And what is and what liberalism has evolved so much and changed, but like what does it mean to like be on the opposite end of that? It means that you want government to have a bigger role in your life. But what does that mean? That's so abstract. And
Yeah.
then you get into the details of like conservatives will say, okay, we're okay with government in your life, but only in this way under these circumstances. And then that's when an Ontario Progressive Party or Ontario Progressive Conservative Party will come in and say, yeah, we like that, you know, like we want to get rid of license plate stickers because government shouldn't be involved or whatever the argument is
Yeah.
there, right? They'll come in and I'll do a policy based on that value set that has like played out a certain way for them. And then you have liberals and NDP that'll do that in their own way, and that's how you get variance. But they're coming from those core values. That's if yeah.
Which is one of the, I know it's different in Canada, but one of the most interesting things is that conservatism and liberalism like aren't always associated to the party. If you look at Democrat traditionally, like they were the ones trying to keep slaves. They were the ones who, you know what I mean? Like it was the Republican that like abolished slaves. And so how that, you're right, like the parties evolve and change, and that's how they flipped. But when you look back at the history, it's so weird. And I keep talking about American politics, but I mean, it's not so different in Canada a lot of the time. You're a strategist. So before we get into the party platforms and like we go through that a little bit more, let's go through the strategy maybe of each party, because we kind of touched on it a little bit in a previous question where, Horvath, is dealing with the misogyny, but is also not very memorable or charismatic. I don't even think most people know who Del Duca is, if I'm being completely honest. Like he has no brand
Not at the start of it.
recognition.
Not at the
Yeah,
start of it, but very much more now. But yeah.
yeah. Being called a robot, and you also have him dealing with the history of liberals. And then you have the coming of Doug Ford, who we've sort of described in a lot more great detail. So what would be the strategy of each party? And I'm asking in the context of, I think a lot of people feel like attack politics is sort of like this new game, especially with social media. Like you're attacking the other party instead of like sort of like boosting yourself up. And what can we do? You're trying to tell everybody how you're bad. So
Yeah.
what what's the strategy of each party, and how much of it is being based in that, that attack factor, that fear factor, versus sort of like the hope factor, and like what we can do, like what sort of strategy is each party using there?
No, good, great question. So Doug Ford, let's start with Ford. So Ford's whole thing is that when you're the incumbent, you're on the defensive. The whole game, you're on the defensive. What you have to do is defend your record. You have to prove to the electorate that you delivered on the things that were important to them and that you need more time to keep doing that right. So all Doug Ford has to do is fight fires that otherwise tell the voters that he did wrong. Here's the thing about the popular opinion of Doug Ford. 6 months ago, people were livid. Not 6 months ago, people were so pissed about how he handled COVID, about schools. And right now at the door, I hear like, yeah, I'm a parent, I'm still mad. I hear
Mm-hmm.
I'm a nurse, I'm still mad.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But most other people are like, he did the best he could. Like in conservative rich areas, right? It's like, oh, I wouldn't want to be the leader during a pandemic. It's like he signed up for the job. And it's all sins forgiven because it was a unprecedented time.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't how the cloth cut for Trudeau at the federal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It wasn't. And that brings me back to the Doug Ford
Mm-hmm.
quality of being one of the people sympathizing, people liking him as a person, and him having that personal appeal, right? So that's his strategy. Is he's going to try to say, look, we did so well for you through COVID. We got everyone vaccinated. They'll try to take credit for stuff that the federal government set up for them. So they'll take credit for things like vaccines, but they'll also take credit for childcare.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll say we're going to deliver childcare for you. So they're going to use that. They're also going to say we're going to invest and we need time to deliver on our investments, like Highway 413. So that's a focus of Doug Ford. That's a big focus of what he's talking about because it is a divisive policy issue that his base is supportive of. So he talks about that investment that came up a lot of the debate, um, and it's just on the defense. So right now, the reason it's working is because he's targeting very specifically the areas that elected him last time,
Mm-hmm.
and maintaining a stronghold in those regions. So any day that the opposition parties are not proving that Doug Ford did not do his job to enough people is a day Doug Ford is winning the election. That is the incumbent advantage. The other parties, Del Duca, you're right, struggled with name recognition, especially at the outset of this. So he had the unfortunate situation of becoming the Liberal leader literally like a weekend or two before COVID happened, I'm pretty sure. So he was the brand new leader and we were in the first lockdown. And so right off the bat, it was kind of like, okay, we're only going to get to know this guy virtually for a long time. And then he comes out and he changes his strategy altogether. You saw him take away the glasses. You saw him I don't know that he dresses differently necessarily, but like even just removing the glasses is like a different look. This stuff, it sounds trivial, but it really matters. Like the way that Hillary dressed changed when she ran for president. We see distinct ways of politicians dressing in order to create brands for themselves. It's important. So he changed how he looked. He changed how he spoke. So now when he speaks, you can tell he's been practicing at relaxing a little bit. And if you were to compare, I'd be really curious to see this, but if you were to compare a speech that he gave like last week to a speech that he gave a year ago, I think it would be night and day because he has really been working on being personal. So how did that come out? At the debate last week, oh my God, I've lost tons of time. But at
2 nights ago.
I know, literally, it feels like it was a week ago. So, so at the debate, Del Duca, it was like chomping at the mic. Like he was very much like he was feisty. He was cutting Doug Ford off. He was chiming in. He was like, "That's incorrect. Absolutely not. You failed Ontario. You failed Ontarians." Like he was, like he can't, and he has a nerdy demeanor that if he channels it right, could be appealing. So that's what he's trying to do, right? Um, People afterwards said that he was very prepared. Like people are very quick to call him robotic, but after that debate it was a turning point for him, I think, in the election, where people now know his name. People already were, increasing their recognition with his name, but especially after the debate, people know his name and they know that he was really prepared. And you got to respect, like, Ontarians respect the hard work in that way. So we'll see how he rides the momentum, because the next 2 weeks will be very integral to how he's going to keep that or lose that. So if he's making more personal speeches, showing his personality more, he's like leaned into this awkward dad thing. Like, I don't know if you've seen the videos of like him and his daughters, but he brings up his daughters all the time, and he like likes to make fun of himself as like a corny dad, and that's what he's going for. So you
Mhm.
see how, like, strategically they're trying to create a person out of him, because what's not in dispute is that he's a good politician. What's not in dispute is that he's an effective policymaker, because he was cabinet minister and he's a long career in politics and he won leadership. Like, his record is there. It's about that person. Andrea Horwath is in a very similar position, in the sense that despite that she's run 3 times previously, people do not know enough about her. And over the course of the last 4 years of being opposition, she didn't necessarily build the brand recognition that I think she could have for herself. Like,
Mm.
if I was her advisor 4 years ago, I would have said, you need to like create a brand for yourself as a person that is going to be memorable to Ontarians. But instead, what she fell into was being an opposition attack dog and just going out and criticizing Ford, which is a part of the job. It's part of what you're supposed to do, but it's not setting yourself up to be successful with your own brand when you're going to provide yourself as an alternative. So it's unfortunate, because I feel like there was so much time there and it was a bit of a wasted opportunity in that sense. So you see her trying in her own way to do exactly what Del Duca has to do. There was on Twitter the other week, maybe it was yesterday, dude. I mean, I'm saying the other week, but maybe it was literally yesterday. I have no clue. That she was, grabbing a beer at a brewery, and she's like, drinking a beer at 11 a.m. or something, and she's making a joke about it. Like, she's showing personality in her tweets. You see that, and it's effective. She's clapping back at the OLP war room on Twitter, which is great. You see her showing her personality, and especially in today's political world, that personality is
Mhm.
everything, and
Mhm.
even more especially up against Doug Ford, because as we talked about, his brand is the strongest thing about him. The fact that he's at the helm of a political, cultural movement, and brand in that way.
Mhm. Also interesting. And I think I'm also curious, when you look at liberals and NDP specifically, right? So both on the outside, official opposition was NDP, but now liberals are leading in the polls. So if you're those two parties, those two leaders who are now not only fighting to get their name known, but they're also fighting each other while they also fight Doug Ford. So they sort of have a lot more like priority setting. Like, how would you go about, setting those priorities? Because you have to separate yourself from the other party, but you
Yeah.
also have to make yourself viable to make sure that like Doug Ford doesn't win. And like I think that's
Yeah.
always the problem progressives have in this country with the vote. You have to fight two enemies at once, where one, like conservatives only have to fight the one, really.
So the way you're saying it is absolutely correct. I was on a live with an organization a few days ago, and I literally almost verbatim was like saying how Doug Ford has the privilege of only fighting a one front war, where he is just fighting the progressive bloc, but the progressives are fighting a two front war because they're fighting each other for the same voter base. So progressives align in a lot of things. The NDP and the Liberal platforms have very similar values and very similar language, and and many very similar priorities, right? Like things like affordability and workers' rights and taxation. And you have like these kind of core value elements that are very similar. So how do they differentiate themselves? It's all an approach. It's all in how they're going to realize the values. So then it becomes a policy discussion, which is, I think it's interesting. I don't, one way or the other, it's probably fair that that is how it ends up being, but it's not the best given these two leaders' particular problem, because policy discussions get nitty gritty and people don't always pay attention to them. So take minimum wage for an example. The NDP are proposing, so both progressive parties, right, off the bat, are saying we need to raise the minimum wage. Doug Ford's government has said $15. It's not in dispute. We're not doing anything. Great. Okay. Progressives have said we need to raise the minimum wage. The NDP are saying we're going to raise everyone's minimum wage to $20 an hour. Okay. Still under living wage, but it's $20 an hour. Del Duca's party says we're going to raise the minimum wage, but we're going to do a regional minimum wage. And so we're going to figure out how to create different regions based on cost of living, so that one region has a bit of a higher and another has a bit of a lower, but it's adjusted to how expensive it is to live in your region. That is a more center-left policy.
Mm.
The former, the Andrea's, is a more NDP policy. Fair enough. It's just approach. So as a voter, you look at that and you go, okay, well, I think, this makes more sense. I think that one makes more sense. I like that one more. I like that approach as a policy more. Except here's the catch. In an ideal world, we're all researching the policies and taking a look at it, but we're all living busy lives. So the average voter is not going to look and they're not going to look into an economist article on how credible a regional minimum wage model is. They're not going to look at graphs or charts and figure out which policy is better. They're not. Even though that's technically what the discussion should be about, it's like, hey, which approach do you agree with as a policy? Because we're not policymakers, we're voters. So it's a really imperfect system in that sense, right?
Mhm.
Like democracy is a beautiful thing, but it's set up with so many internal contradictions in this way where both of those parties have had extensive research teams do a lot of work to develop platforms that are both costed, right? So both have a financial plan and that are both in line with their values and deliver policy solutions that they think are actually going to be attainable. If you publish something that isn't true in a platform, you're totally screwed. Like your opposition is going to drag you for it. You're going to lose so much credibility. So there are high stakes. So much thought has gone into these policies. But even still, people are not going to make their decision based on how different the approach is, despite that they maybe should.
It's hard. Yeah. And I always like to sort of consider that, not only are we busy, but like sort of like our political literacy is quite low. And like you said, it's like most people, that's why I think Doug Ford is so successful in a way that he's just someone I want to grab a beer with, like that's what I want in my politician. I just want to, I think it'd be great to have a beer with. And most people sort of just vote that way. Like, I like that guy. I think he's cool.
I like that guy.
Or I like that woman. Like whatever.
I know.
It's mostly men,
Yeah.
but
Wealthy men, because like you don't want to grab a drink with a woman if you don't want to sleep with her if you're a guy. Like that's like that's the misogynist lens there,
yes.
right? Frankly. Anyway.
So let's go through the parties and what they're offering. Not the whole, we're not going to go through the whole platform, but sort of like the highlights, the most notable items. And let's start with the Conservatives and Ford. I know they released a budget before they sort of, I can't remember what the word is, but they resolved their sort of the chamber or whatever it's called in Ontario, the legislator. So is that basically the same as that? And what sort of things are in their platform that maybe could help people or that is most notable?
For sure. So they introduced a budget as government. And that budget just outlines the intended spending. It wasn't passed. It was just introduced. So then Parliament dissolved and we went into the election. And since then, Doug Ford has not put up a platform on his website. Like there's no Progressive Conservative Party. There's no Progressive Conservative Party platform document that you can download. You can download the Liberal NDP Green one. You cannot download Doug Ford's. You can link through a couple different landing pages. If you go through, you can link back to the Ontario budget that was, again, the Ontario budget introduced by Peter Bethenfalvey. Like it's not a platform, it's just the anticipated spending. And the argument being, well, you can look at what the government's priorities are, what they would do. So it's the same thing, but there's something to be said for the practice of actually creating a digestible platform for your audience. But again, they don't have to prove anything. They just have to defend their record. So that's all they have to do strategically, right? Anyway, a big issue that he's emphasizing is Highway 413 because infrastructure is supposed to increase accessibility between communities. And it's like a infrastructure as well as a transit promise in a way. Ford is saying that he's going to increase community safety by adding funding to the police. So that's a very interesting one as well. There are a couple different pieces there. Like they're going to continue on with with the spending they've previously been doing across social programs, which is to say that they've severely diminished social programs over the past couple of years. There's just so many pieces there of that platform. I'm racking my brain from the debate too of what Doug Ford was trying to highlight, but he's not proposing new policies per se in his key messaging from what I've seen. His key messaging when he stands up on a podium is, we delivered for you. We helped you get through the pandemic. We supported small businesses because they had small business grants and they had funding opportunities for them, right? We helped vaccine distribution because they helped facilitate all that. We created the vaccine like passport. We did mandates and lockdowns that were good, and we helped businesses get through it and all this and that. That's what he's trying to say. We're going to help ventilation in schools. That's what he's trying to say. So, but it's not that there's a new ideas. It's just him saying we did it, so we'll keep doing it.
If you like me, let's keep going.
Let's keep going. So does that answer your question about Ford? Does that answer kind of the
Yes.
conservative? It's
Sort
yeah.
of,
I'm not the
sort of.
most. Yeah.
It's shady. I don't know. Like, for me, I'm just kind of like, oh.
We're coming at this from a very progressive standpoint, right? Like, there are so
Yes.
many people who in Northern Ontario are like, oh yeah, like Doug Ford was fine. Like, I didn't feel grievance, so why shouldn't he just keep going? I don't
Right.
want someone to come in and throw it upside down. It
Yeah,
works.
devil you know
It works
versus,
tactically.
yeah, devil you know versus the devil you don't, basically.
That's exactly it. So
Yeah.
that's the whole tactic
Very
there.
interesting.
Um,
Let's do Liberal. So Del
let's do Liberal.
Duca, you mentioned a couple of his minimum wage and stuff. We haven't even gotten to affordability and inflation. So are these parties also sort of tackling that idea in their platforms?
So absolutely. So Del Duca's affordability pieces are so the Liberal approach this time around are very much hybrid approaches to policies, which is interesting in the sense that think about Buck a Ride. Buck a Ride is a transit policy. It is saying let's make $1 public transit across Ontario a thing. Okay. It's going to help affordability because obviously you can get a monthly pass for $40. That's going to change how many people can commute. Great. People can commute to work. It makes their day-to-day living cheaper, but it also encourages people to do staycations in Ontario and travel across Ontario to smaller towns and create economic stimulus elsewhere. So you're suddenly also becomes an economic development policy because you're also helping, rural and places across Ontario make money and generate economic flow. Great. Okay, cool. It's also an environmental policy because you're getting 400,000 or I don't want to get the number wrong, but it's a couple 100,000 cars are being taken off the road. So it's like this. That's what I mean when I say hybrid. It's like this integrated kind of like a thing going for it, right? There's also for affordability policies, if I'm remembering correctly, an HST, removing HST on prepared foods $20 and under. So that's a very digestible, easy to understand policy that'll reduce your day-to-day cost of living. There's a bunch of other stuff in there in affordability because all the parties have had to really, really focus on affordability.
I think, when we talk about the single biggest issue, maybe, I think that's what's on most people's mind. I can't afford gas.
It is.
Food is going wild and my wage has not been going up.
And what was that, sorry?
And my wage hasn't gone up. So how am I supposed to afford to live in this province, in this country, in the world in general right now? But we talk about all these lovely policies and that's great. But I think for most voters, it's how do I afford to live and eat? That's the biggest thing on people's minds.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true. And that's why, and so then you get to the minimum wage promise, right? So on the Liberal front, we talked wage already know, so I'll quickly on, but it's that regional minimum wage versus that $20 minimum wage. And so I wonder what people are going to pick, because people who vote for a minimum wage, are they voting for it because they're thinking of themselves and they're like, I would like this wage, or are they thinking about it from economically, I understand that there are systems in place right now that might react badly if we jack up minimum wage. I don't know, I'm not an economist, right? But my question is not whether or not that's true. It's more, are people going to ask that question? What are they going to think about when they're choosing a wage policy? There are also other affordability policies, things like lowering your overall cost of living includes lowering the things that you engage with every day in society. So the NDP have promised to reduce mental health costs, so provide a mental health program, right? And Liberals have something on that, but I can't remember. So the NDP have done we'll give you mental health care, we'll give you, OSAP loans converted to grants, something like that. They have a couple other affordability policies like that are focusing on reducing your day-to-day moving through the world. And that, of course, you have housing, right? Which is interwoven in this. So increasing housing supply, that's pretty common. You see that at the federal and at the provincial level. What gives me hope about this is that no matter which way people go, both provincial and federal governments are going to be really focused on housing.
And all parties.
Which means all parties and all
Yeah.
parties, and which also means that the municipal governments are also going to be focused on it, and we also have a municipal race happening this year. So generally,
That's right.
progressives are pretty aligned with like, okay, we have to increase housing supply. We have to figure out, there's a foreign buyers ban now federally implemented, and so we have to, we have to see like how that's going to affect the market. There are some people who are more on the left who are calling for like, ban multiple homeowners, like get people to stop buying multiple investment properties. Then you also have like forces with the more conservative side of things that are like, don't do that. We have to keep houses at a certain value and this and that. And so either way, housing is going to be a focus at all levels of government, which gives me hope because I think that's how you get something to actually move quickly.
Mhm. In terms of healthcare, I think that's another huge issue that's come I mean, the last 2 years, whether it's pandemic response, nursing shortages, long-term care, like it goes across the board about how broken it is in our system. And I know we
Mm.
haven't got to NDP or Green yet, but just in terms of liberal and conservative, is there stuff that they're planning on doing to try to like help with that? Like,
Yeah.
there's so much there, right? Because you talk about PSWs, nursing, doctor shortages, rural areas versus urban area. Like there's just a lot there. But what are sort of the parties, at least conservatives and liberals, talking about there?
100%. So for this one, the big debate is between, I'll just give you the highlights. The big debate
Yeah.
is between the for-profit, not-for-profit long-term care stuff. So Doug Ford is for-profit long-term care. He's actually privatized aspects of our provincial health system that the liberals have been calling him out for and being like, you have like sneakily privatized a good chunk of this system. We need to move it back to a public system, and we need to add more funding for PSWs and for like hospitals and whatever, but also to repeal wage suppression legislation, which has been really contentious in politics in general in the last like 6 months because Doug Ford's government introduced Bill 124, which suppressed nurses' wages. It said you literally cannot like have your wages like increased during a pandemic. That's how they said thank you. That's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that's why I was telling you earlier, I'm getting nurses at the door when I'm door knocking saying,
Oh yeah.
like, we're pissed, right? Of course. So the progressive parties and I know the liberals have come out very hard on this one, being like, you absolutely need to repeal this law. So they would do that. That's a big part of their healthcare policy, increasing the number of long-term care homes that are public and building more, as well as putting more seniors in long-term care homes and out of like just basically anti-for-profit long-term care. That's it. And then you have the added funding to the healthcare system in general, right? Like conservatives, when they come into government, the general consensus is that they come into government and they cut the two biggest budgets, and those are healthcare and education.
Yeah.
So progressives tend to come in and fund them. It all depends on where you think money should be flown. And the progressive bloc would, I think, just add a bunch of money and funding into those systems, recognizing that we need them.
How do the liberals propose, spending that? Is it just an allocation of resources? Is there a new tax? Is it like the quote unquote, tax the rich, pay their fair share, which is a very progressive sentiment? Is there anything about that, like the liberal platform? And again, I know we're going to get to the NDP, so we can speak on that as well.
Yeah.
But just sort of like, is there a costing for that?
Yeah, so there's costing for both the progressive platforms, and you can find them online, but I don't know the costing off the top of my head. I'm actually in that, like, it's a very good point. I don't know if it's as like ideological as like a tax the rich, pay this. I think it's more about reallocating funding. So Doug Ford has put billions on the table to go towards Highway 413, and I think the liberal slash NDP approach is like, well, if you just take the money that you're planning to spend on that and instead just put that into healthcare and education, then that's way better for society and for buck ride transit. And that's way better for us in general because your highway is only going to reduce commute times by 30 seconds. So let's think about our priorities. Like that's it.
Right.
So it's at the federal level, the federal liberals were like, we're going to tax the rich. Like their luxury tax is literally moving through right now. That's going to tax insurance and banks. So like that's very ideological at the federal level, but here it hasn't been a narrative of tax the rich as much from like either. It's been more like well, figure out your priorities. You're not going to pay for a highway. You're going to pay for transit or hospitals or this and that.
Yeah. So NDP, How do they differ from the Liberals? What are they promising? What are they hoping to accomplish here?
I struggle with this because their platforms, in my opinion, are quite similar, but the NDP have more, and in some cases, more ambitious promises. So take the reduction of auto insurance to even start with, right? They're promising a reduction in auto insurance costs because Ontario has some of the highest auto insurance rates in the country. I'm from BC. I grew up in BC, and we have a public auto insurer, and my rates were, would have been lower there than here. And not like I own a car, but it's a completely different system. And so the Liberals are proposing to like readjust the auto insurance regimes, like change like the no fault regime with accidents and this and that. And it's like technical changes to that would, in their opinion, make rates a bit different. But the NDP are coming out hard with like, we want to reduce rates by 40%. And so then the question for a voter is like, well, which do I believe will have? It's the same thing. It's like the how to, because both of these parties are like, we got to lower auto insurance rates.
Right.
But the Liberals are proposing, I can't recall the exact details of their policy, but it's like it's not flat out, we're gonna lower the rates by 40%. I don't know how the NDP would do that, but they're coming out hard with that promise, right? And so you can find that costing in their platform, but they have this tendency to be more like, we're doing this high bar and we're coming out hard on this high bar. And that's the nature of like the way their rhetoric is and their policy positioning is. They're more ambitious towards the left, as people kind of acknowledge. And then you have that Liberals that are typically a more center left party that are like, oh, maybe we moderate expectations a little bit. And it's just a difference in approach, because at the end of the day, both want to reduce auto insurance rates. So
similar to healthcare and affordability, they go with Liberals that like, yeah, we need to do something, but it's just a matter of those things that they're going to believe. Is there anything notable in those categories? I don't know, to rent, to gasoline, like,
rent
all
control.
the things.
Rent control. I know Liberals have promised rent control. I don't know if the New Democrats have promised rent control. I would have to look that up.
Do we not have rent control here? I think we do limited.
We did, but then Ford took it away.
Ooh.
Kathleen Wynne introduced it. And then before Kathleen Wynne, Mike Harris took it away, like way back when, before the Liberals reintroduced it, right? The Conservative government prior. Yeah. Anyway.
One of the biggest things with an NDP government is, again, in Ontario, you think of Bob Rae. I know my parents talk about that all the time, my grandparents, like that is just entrenched in people's minds. And for those who don't know, Bob Rae, and explain it a little bit better if I mess anything up here, but basically made people work days for free so they could pay for stuff. Public sector workers, nurses, teachers had a select number of days that were basically working for free. And that's just, every time you see an NDP government, I think a lot of people are like, I really like that, but how are we going to pay for it? That's always what I hear. And like, truthfully, I don't know. I even feel that way sometimes. I'm like, I love the ambitious promises, but are they actually obtainable? Like, do you think, I mean, it's great that you can say that, but do you think that like the things that they're promising are actually doable, or is it just wishful thinking?
I mean, I don't want to bias someone one way or the other. I always bias people progressively, but I mean, you have to make a choice based on what your experience of the world is. Because I'm not as much as I love this stuff, like I'm not an economist. I don't know.
Yeah,
and I do my best as a voter myself to try to figure out which approach I agree with. And I'm someone who, like, it's going to change. It's never as easy as saying, well, this party is always this way. I know conservative governments have spent far more irresponsibly before, plenty of times, and bailed out corporations when they shouldn't have. And that's not necessarily responsible spending either, right? But then you have, like, every government can spend irresponsibly. That's the thing. It just becomes a question of, like, how much do you trust how ambitious the promises are? So people lose even Trudeau federally. They lose him because they're like, oh, it's too ambitious. And we saw what happened when Trudeau said, I'm going to give you electoral reform. It was like the most ambitious promise Canadians had heard in so long. And we were like, yes, amazing. And then he got into government and launched an inquiry commission. And then it said, yo, this is like literally impossible within our system. You'd have to completely overhaul the Westminster system. And he went, oh, fuck, like, I literally can't do that. And then, there are obviously people say there are also political incentives there that would disincentive him from doing that. But like, he wouldn't have promised it if he didn't already think about those. So I think it was really more procedural. You know what I mean? So anyway, I know this is not about the federal, but it's more me illustrating this point that, like, ambitious promises have a tendency of biting us in, coming back to bite us in the ass. Like it's hard, but you got to think that when these progressive parties are making these ambitious promises, when Andrea Horvath says $20 minimum wage, when Del Duca says buck ride transit, it's not nowhere. It's why it's now normal to have costed platforms, and it adds huge amount of credibility when you can point to a line item and say, here's how you would spend for this, which is great. But it all comes down to faith. Bob Ray is a liberal, fun fact. Like
Yeah.
Bob Ray's literally a liberal, I'm sure you know. And it's like he was literally the federal liberal leader for a hot minute there, an interim leader, right? And he's now a special envoy to the UN, and he's fully a liberal. And so this is an interesting shared water between the two progressives. It just speaks to what we've been saying this whole time. This progressive bloc that's split, it seems to be split in approach way more than it is in ideology.
Right.
So yeah.
I was just gonna say, we haven't really talked about the Green Party, but I don't want to leave them out. But I couldn't even tell you the leader's name, unfortunately. I'm just very uneducated. Mike Schreiner. I'm just very uneducated with the Green Party, which is sort of, I think, their issue. They're always kind of there, but they're not really there. So is there anything noteworthy with the Green Party that people should be made aware of?
So what I can speak to in the Green Party is, first of all, the Green Party, if you're a progressive, the Green Party has even stronger rhetoric than the NDP. Like they come out hard with their activism in their rhetoric. And I think it's language that appeals especially to Gen Z and the way Gen Z talk about politics. So their website is very interesting. It's so clearly targeted towards like that young activist bloc, right? Because it's like the rebel choice in a lot of ways. Because okay, so let me talk about Mike Schreiner and the debate earlier this week. Mike Schreiner at that debate, like he won that debate. He won that debate because he was the leader that every progressive wished their party had at the helm of it, I think, that night. Like if we're talking like who actually won the debate electorally, it was Del Duca and Doug Ford. Like they both walked away from that way better. But if we're talking in performance, easily Mike Schreiner, because he was personal, he was passionate, he cared about what he was talking about, he was compelling, he like grilled Doug Ford in the way that Del Duca was really trying to, but he did it effortlessly. He was like, "Have you talked to a nurse recently, Doug? Like Mr. Ford, like have you seen how hard it's been on the ground for them in hospitals?" Like he was grilling him, and people heard him speak and they went, "Yeah!" Like they got fired up. If only he was the leader of the Liberals. If only he was the leader of the NDP. Perhaps then progressives could unite around him a little bit. But the unfortunate thing is that he and the entire Ontario voter base know that the Greens are not going to form government, and they know that they're not going to scoop all too many seats. And literally up on that stage, he was like he wasn't going for premier. He was not fighting to be premier. He was like, "We can win some seats." Like he literally said that at one point.
Give us one, please.
I remember I laughed out loud when he said that because I was like, he knows what he's going for. He's ambitious in his platform, but he's realistic in his strategy. You know what I mean? Like he wants to scoop. He wants to say he's the only Green rep in the provincial legislature. He wants Diane Sachs to be up there with him. He wants her to win University Rosedale. Like that performance was so that they could get 2, maybe 3 seats.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's what he's going for.
He had nothing to lose.
He had nothing to lose, right? And everything again. That was, you know what? That was the last week. That was the first time. Last week. I keep saying last week. I said it was last week. 2 days ago. 2 days ago. That is time. That debate, Mike Schreiner, that was the Greens' first time included. And so they had never been included before. And them being on that stage itself was like, unfortunately, really good for Doug Ford because it's an even further split of the progressive vote and it takes up more airtime, right? Yeah. So it's a weird, that always happens, right? But in a different sense, for people who complain our electoral system squeezes you into strategic voting, a minor party is getting a center stage and is growing. So I don't know what that means for the future of the Greens. I don't know what that means for the future of progressives, but it's good. It's good for Mike Schreiner. In any case.
Yeah, go on, Mike Schreiner. And then lastly, you mentioned it briefly. I don't even think they probably have a platform. They're just out there being against woke activism. The New Blue Party, I know, is sort of is like this new emerging subsection of those far right voters. I've only seen a little bit. I don't even see too many signs. I I don't even think they're noteworthy, but maybe just a quick mention on if there's anything there.
So
Or
the
if
New
they're
Blue
just
Party is, or if they're just, sorry.
the latest like white craze of angry people.
So the New Blue Party is alarming for sure, but I think what's even more alarming is the Ontario Party.
Okay.
Because the Ontario Party is the anti-Ford, like we hate Doug Ford, he's not conservative enough. We're the right-wing, anti-vax, anti-mandate people, and they hired Roger Stone, the former senior Trump advisor,
Oh shit.
to be their campaign strategist. And that makes me think of two things. The first is Roger Stone really that bored? And the second, how did they afford him? How did they pay for him?
Yeah, who's the
Like
backer?
when you're Roger Stone, you're charging tens of thousands of dollars for like a single campaign. It is lucrative, and they can pay for him. I was like, so that was alarming because what we don't, and I would need to check how many donations, and you can check who's donated to what party, by the way, online. But I need to check who's donated to them, because where are they getting their money? Where is their support?
Yeah.
Why are they a thing? That's what
Very
alarms me.
Very
Yeah.
interesting point, and I think everyone should kind of look into that.
Mhm.
I don't want you to have to like predict everything that happens, but what do you think the next sort of week and a bit will look like in terms of ramping up to election day on June 2nd?
Next week and a bit, ramping up to election day on June 2nd. Okay, so this part of the campaign is the advanced polls push, is what we call. So we have 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks left, essentially, right? And campaigns have one objective right now, and it's what we call GOTV, get out the vote. So GOTV is the most important part of any campaign. When you have campaigners coming and knocking on your door, they're not there to convince you or have a debate. They're there to figure out if you're their supporter, and if you are, their job is to get you to the polls. It's called IDing. So this is across all parties. Like you walk into a campaign, you learn this the day one that you go knock on doors, is that you're there to ID voters and supporters. And often it involves a conversation at the door. Maybe you can flip a vote or two, but really it's about figuring out who you're going to get to the polls. So in advance polls, obviously you can vote early, and advance polls open, Thursday 19th. So you should be going and voting as of right now if you are able, at one of your advance polls locations that you can find online with Elections Ontario. But campaigns are going to be calling you and hounding you and knocking on your door in order to get you to the polls from this point onward. And this is where the tactical part of a campaign is now the most important. Like before this, it was messaging, promises, personality, all of these things like that are more fluffy and that are like, here are our candidates, here is our leader, introducing ourselves to you, the voters. Now it's get your ass to the polls. If you support us, go vote right now. And that's what we're going to see the next 2 weeks. So we're going to see parties talking about how you need to vote now. You're going to see language around you've already made up your mind, come vote for us. Because the convincing part of it, the we're going to persuade you as of this week is over, and now it's get your butt to the polls. Yeah.
So I guess for a last sort of, you're very engaged. You're doing this on your off time and doing the campaigning and everything. What's your last message to Ontario voters? What do you want them to know? You've sort of briefly touched on it, but just give a final word to you about to the Ontario voters, and get them out to vote.
I always speak to people on TikTok, and when I do lives and this and that, like I always seem to speak from an educational standpoint. Like I come to inform, and I come to analyze, and I bring all my academic background to it when I do. But I think for this question, let me speak as a person. I understand that systems are awful and they can be really frustrating and slow and oppressive. But our system exists, and you have the right to vote and get involved with it. And that is an immense honor and a fantastic right. So believe in the fact of your right, believe in yourself as someone who can make change, and have patience with it, and go cast a ballot. Even if you don't feel 100%, even if you're not fully satisfied with any party, even if you feel like you're biting the bullet and doing something you feel like you have to. I'm not going to tell you to or not to strategic vote, but whatever your feelings towards the imperfection of this election, just go vote. Compromise, go vote and exercise your right, because this is not the last election. Opportunities to make change will come again and are always present. But a part of it is participating every 4 years when this opportunity comes around. And it will never be the last one, because so long as we're actually using our right, we will get to keep making change. So don't throw your right away. We fought really hard for it. And when I say we, I mean we, right? Like I mean all of us from marginalized communities that did not always have this right. Like stand on the shoulders of all of us who came before us and use your right and use your voice.
Yes, absolutely wise words. And then final parting, the words of South Park. Sometimes you just have to pick between a giant douche and a turd sandwich. That's none of our options.
Amazing how you said everything I said in so many few words.
But you're so right. And Anushka, thank you so much. We almost did an hour and a half. So
That's
much
crazy.
of going
Flew
over.
by.
But your knowledge, your wisdom, your charisma. I hope one day you choose to vote or choose to run, because you got my vote.
Oh,
but
that's so nice.
Keep up the incredible work. I love your passion. I love your energy. And I just appreciate you. So where do people, I know you have a great TikTok, I've already referenced it. Where do people find you? I don't know if you have a website, like to connect with people. Please plug everything.
I feel like I'm still very much an amateur at all this, to be quite honest. So no, I don't have any personal branding yet of any kind. But you can find me on TikTok at Politicono, please, which is like you'll add it, I'm sure, to when you
Yes.
this. But yeah, it's a I have actually a TikTok explaining that name, so watch that one. And yeah, you can find me on TikTok. You can also find me on LinkedIn. And every now and then I pop onto radio and this and that, so maybe you'll hear me at some point. But reach out over TikTok, comment, or add me on LinkedIn. Yeah.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much. This was truly a pleasure for me.
It was so fun. Thank you for chatting with me.